Hi, my name is Julie Smith, and I'm the Executive Director of the Identity Defined Security Alliance, and I want to thank you for joining us today. Our webinar today is presented by IDSA member CyberArk, Comprehensive PAM, Defending Endpoints, Third Parties, and DevSecOps. We are recording today's session, so please make sure to share the link with your colleagues. In addition to a link to the recording, you'll also receive a link to the slides that will be used in today's discussion. You can submit questions for our speaker through the Q&A chat window. And lastly, we are now an approved ISC squared CPE submitter partner. There's a link in the portal where you can provide your ISC squared member number, and we will submit to ISC squared on your behalf. Before I turn it over to our presenter today, a quick commercial for the Identity Defined Security Alliance. The IDSA is a nonprofit organization that facilitates community collaboration to help organizations reduce risk by providing education, best practices, and resources to implement identity-defined security. Our vendor membership is comprised of leading identity and security vendors, in addition to our customer advisory board members who provide guidance on our mission and represent the practitioner community. In addition, we've recently introduced 2 new membership types for end users and companies. Check out the membership page on idsalliance.org for more information. All of our resources are freely available on our website. Check back frequently for the latest blogs, upcoming webinars, or to sign up for our newsletter to get the latest info on Identity Management Day, which is coming up April 12th. So let's get started.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Julie. And sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, we jumped the gun on that one. I was going to
my bad.
You are first. So our presenter today is Brandon Traffenstedt, who is Senior Director, Global Technology Office at CyberArk. So welcome, Brandon, and I will now turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Julie. And as you can tell, I'm excited, maybe a little too much so, to have been invited to present alongside you and as part of the IDSA webinar series. So thank you so much for the invite. And to everyone who's watching, thank you for watching and tuning in. As Julie mentioned, my name is Brandon. Most people at CyberArk call me BT because my last name is a literal sneeze. But I'm one of the global technology officers at CyberArk, focusing on making sure that what we're building aligns with trends that we're seeing in the market around both PAM, but also around identity security at large, ensuring that we're not just building stuff that CyberArk thinks is cool, but stuff that you all can actually use. And even if you choose not to use elements of our platform, curating good advice that may be common practices to you, or might actually sort of shift gears a little bit. And speaking of shift gears, today, I'm going to talk to you about PAM. I love PAM. I feel like if I didn't like PAM, they wouldn't keep me around at CyberArk. But we're going to expand the concept of PAM a little bit. We'll look at the evolution of this notion of privileged access management, privileged account management, privileged account security, and kind of show the areas of, I'll call it digression, from what we traditionally think of as PAM to what organizations need these days to establish a strong foundation around above average access, which you've now heard my definition of PAM. And I'll tell you a couple stories. You'll get a couple of terrible metaphors in the session. My apologies for them in advance. But what you're looking at here is not my front lawn. It's very beautifully manicured, though, and I kind of wish that it was. But during the pandemic, as I imagine many of you, I spent a lot of time inside. Some of you are probably thinking, you probably spent a lot of time inside anyway. But in any case, I spent more time inside during the pandemic. And I began to notice a trend. Many of you have probably seen it too, where if someone's delivering a package or food or whatever it is to your front door, you expect them to take this beautifully manicured path to the front door, give you a little knock, and then your stuff is there. But what tends to happen more often than not? Right across the grass. Almost every single time, without fail, folks will meander across your, in this case, very beautifully manicured grass. So then one day, I did fertilizer, and there was a keep off the grass sign that was sitting right in the path that most folks tend to take. And what do you think happened? Did they keep off the grass? No, they just went down another part of the grass, right? It's, quickest point between A and B. So I started thinking, well, what would happen if I put up another keep off the grass sign? I imagine folks would just move in between those signs. And now we start to see that metaphor as it relates to security around powerful access. Many of you, not just to mention folks at CyberArk and the greater IDSA community, like we've been around a while. We've started to design these different attack paths that threat actors take. And a lot of times when we look at enforcing security, we might take a reactive approach around those commonly used paths, the equivalent of placing down these please keep off the grass signs. But at some point, we put so many signs in the ground that we just lose our minds. And maybe instead, we should shift gears a little bit. Maybe instead of focusing on logical barriers or diverting back to physical barriers, that's the castle wall thing we saw in the early 90s moving into the early 2000s around the network perimeter. Maybe instead of these signs, we begin to look at how we can anticipate attack, how we can anticipate folks to walk on our grass. And I think that metaphor will be the key to how PAM has expanded. I'll add in another element here, and that is we assume that these threat actors or delivery people are going to be humans. They can read the sign. We also have to anticipate that that zombies are going to show up. Zombies aren't going to read your signs. They're interested in brains. They're going right for your front door. So when we start to look at things like polymorphic malware, as an example, when we start to look at I'll call it the new threat actor who's looking to shake things up a little bit, we also have to plan for some illogical elements of security to match the logical ones. So, full long story short, yelling "get off my lawn" over and over again as it relates to security, putting up different signs in the ground, that's not the way we feel and I feel that we approach things. Instead, it's about doing things like ensuring coverage, making sure that not only are we making our grass stronger in the areas where we believe those zombies or delivery folks are going to walk, but it also means to plant better grass. Reactive versus proactive security is a big, big key to this very silly metaphor that I'll put a cap on here a moment. And then finally, that notion of logical versus illogical controls, a control that we put in place 3 years ago, a vendor that we put in place 5 years ago, if we're not recertifying those, if we're not challenging, say, those vendors to modernize and expanding our scope, then we run the risk of those zombies sort of tootling over the grass. And then finally, I know I'm preaching to the converted here, but making sure that we're automating any elements of security here means that we can focus on, other elements of our grass. So long story short, we'll keep that metaphor in the back of our minds, unless you hate it. If you hate the metaphor, forget that it exists in the first place, as we get into a little bit more tangible elements. So how does this all relate to PAM? Well, the grass that we're talking about here, or maybe even the brains that those zombies were really, really hungry for, are TierZero levels of access, privileged accounts. And a long, long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, or not really, right? Going back 40, even 50 years ago with those mainframes, we had this definition of TierZero. It's anything that sits in that creamy nougaty center of the organization that could be used as the endpoint for negative gain. Domain administrative accounts, local admin, the sys account on those mainframes, built-in database accounts on network devices, that kind of thing. That's where the idea of PAM began. And it's still important, right? These elements still exist, right? If you haven't moved everything to the cloud, as an example, you're still going to have likely an on-prem domain. You're still going to have that TierZero that exists. But I'll submit to you all that the definition of TierZero, with the adoption of the cloud, with the introduction of a number of other themes I'll share with you, that's caused us to begin looking outside of the context of PAM in the on-prem data center. Now, how has the world changed? Boom, headline slide. Can't have a presentation without one. These are just a couple of examples of what we're seeing from the consistency of controls across, say, Windows and Linux. Full disclosure, that's my background. I was a Linux administrator before CyberArk adopted me. So being consistent in controls, being consistent when we start to look at, say, elements of a traditional waterfall-based supply chain, monolithic application servers, that kind of thing, or elements of the modern supply chain. And I could go on about that for hours. I won't. But being consistent across things like securing access to CI/CD, both from a tool, but also a developer perspective as well as looking deeper into things like developer identity and access and securing the developer's workspace. We'll touch on these concepts today. But as I was saying, the world has changed. You're like, duh, of course the world has changed. But what we have seen is that scope expand, as I said. Those on-prem data centers have moved to infrastructure as a service in, say, a single public cloud vendor. Or many of your organizations may have taken a multi-cloud path. So not only do we have to worry about an ever sort of increasing and automated or even ephemeral server space in the cloud, but now we got to start looking at the cloud identity too. So we're not just confined by that on-prem logic. As I'll share with you a little bit more, we've also seen what PAM is from a user perspective begin to shift into folks like the vendors we trust or elements of the workforce who weren't considered or weren't formally known as privileged users as the definition of the term. So we're seeing a series of dichotomies in areas where consistent controls, as I mentioned in the grass metaphor, really start to come into the mix. But even with environment changes, foundational PAM hasn't changed. The things that we need to do haven't shifted. What has shifted, though, is the priority, the level of automation, and then certain number of unique attributes that we might look to deal with when you're lifting and shifting infrastructure into the cloud, as an example. When we look at foundational PAM, we still want to do things like know what we don't know, discover secrets that are out there. We want to be able to programmatically onboard these things to your vault of choice. We want to be able to rotate these bad boys, right? Foundational PAM stuff that I imagine many, if not all of you, are super, super familiar with. So it hasn't changed. The need for discovery has just grown because of the sheer scale of the type of privileged access we're looking at today, as an example here. If we move forward, and this is the last thing I'll say about traditional PAM-y elements, even ones that apply to our cloud environments, there's the other element of the governance, the audit trail, the security that comes from isolating and monitoring sessions, as an example. 2 decades ago, we could get away with telling a Linux user, hey, buddy, by the way, you're going to use PAM now, and the way you get access to your systems is you log into a browser. No, I don't want to log into a browser, but you log into a browser, you click a connect button, and then we'll give you this little 640 by 480 window in window kind of thing. And this is how you do your work now. That could pass after a compelling event or 2 decades ago. Today, with more millennials and Gen Zs in the workplace, by the way, millennial, I'm in the midpoint. I can tell you that if you tell me to go through that workflow, I will find a group of other administrators. I will find your office and I will knock on that door angrily. Insert other threat here, but it's just not going to pass as our organizations become more operationally driven. So the jam here is doing these things thoughtfully. Things like letting users use their own clients or browsers. That's where we've seen a big shift, as well as asking the question, do I need to wait to vault an account associated with, say, an ephemeral piece of compute? Think an ephemeral virtual machine in the cloud that's only going to be around for a week. Do I really need to vault that thing? Probably not. Instead, let's begin to look at ephemeral access, just-in-time access, access based on tagging and that kind of stuff. So even these traditional concepts have shifted significantly, but there's also the end game, right? I talked about TierZero, right? Even if you're looking at a TierZero that has evolved into cloud stuff, if your TierZero goes back to those mainframes and more traditional systems, you may look at it as, well, cool. Say I've brought these things under management. I've discovered them. I've vaulted them. I'm rotating them. I'm doing isolation and monitoring. You may think, I'm done, right? That's it. I have seen the beginning to the end of PAM. And that's where we get into, I think, the main notion of this session, and that is you've only put down one very important keep off the grass sign. And I apologize. I realize that I told you I'd end the metaphor, but it just keeps popping in. So I hope you'll indulge me to keep including it. So I want to shake things up a little bit and share with you a very embarrassing picture. So as you can tell, that very handsome gentleman on the left is me. And I do happen to be sharing the same shirt with another one of my colleagues. I think we were definitely working. We were at Black Hat, probably 2016. So CyberArk was paying us to do this. I feel like I'm going to be fired after the top of the hour. But the reason I share with you this very embarrassing picture is that, hi, I'm a workforce user. As you can tell from the photo here, CyberArk does not trust me to access any of the services that we host. Any of our SaaS services I do not have backend access to, because you better believe, even if I meant well, I'd probably see a squirrel out my window and mess something up. But that would mean I was a privileged user, a traditional privileged user, right? But think about it. And think about even your own types of access as well. I don't have privileged access to servers or services that we run, but I do have pretty high level access into CyberArk CRM information. I've got access into our HR data, our finance data too. I know it sounds crazy, but I do. While I'm not a traditional privileged user by the definition, my access is sensitive. And that access could be used for negative gain, even if it's just business continuity. And I say business continuity, but that's a pretty big deal too. So what about users like me? Or maybe not users like me. I think I'm a bad example from this picture here, but what about users in your finance team, users on your sales teams, if you offer services that are sold externally, or members of your HR team, as an example? These types of users, as well as things like social media teams, for those of us whose branding is make or break to our external perception in the market, for users like that, we need PAM adjacent or PAM-like controls. Things as simple as multi-factor for your social media team are significant increases to security posture. I imagine many, if not all of you, have strong authentication, but if you don't, that's the thing you do right away. But it's not just about strong authentication. Going back to my note about millennials and Gen Z, it's about strong authentication that isn't absolutely terrible to use, so that users start to find workarounds. And this includes things like education programs, phishing acknowledgement programs, things like that. When we start to look at technology, it includes things like adaptive authentication. Reducing authentication fatigue, I think, is key to modern PAM and identity programs these days, because if I've got to re-authenticate 100 times, you better believe I'm going to be grumpy after time number 3. So finding ways that we can include things like behavior-based authentication is key to PAM programs these days. As well as, earlier I mentioned kind of this notion of session isolation and session monitoring. A lot of times we're going to use that for firewall access, right? Shared accounts, root as an example, X_admin, or any number of built-in accounts out there. But if you look at sensitive access, say a developer's access to a public code repository, they're probably going to use their own identity, and you're probably going to be doing federation. If not, it's an incredible idea. But that type of access wouldn't use some vaulted secret somewhere. Still is sensitive, still is important. So there are tools out there today, and I'm biased, right? CyberArk does this, but it allows us to keep using a federated identity, but for sensitive access, to do something like leverage a browser extension for recording or continuous authentication as an example. So TLDR here, it's taking those PAM-like controls and applying them to that new sensitive access user of the workforce. This includes stuff like having a spot for them to store passwords that wouldn't traditionally be managed by a traditional password manager. So workforce password management, stuff like that, very, very beneficial when we start to zero in on the increasingly critical, from a security standpoint, workforce. Speaking of the workforce, keep my image in the back of your head if you can stomach it. The workforce also happens to be the link between all of the terrible things in the outside world, or the good things, depending on if you're an optimist versus a pessimist, but a link between all that stuff and your network. The link there, outside of me putting hands on keyboard, is the thing that the keyboard is attached to. So when we're looking at a comprehensive PAM program, we got to take a step from the workforce and also start to look at our endpoints from a security posture standpoint. I'll submit to you that the most dangerous thing, which also equals the quickest win from a security perspective on the endpoint, is users with local administrative rights. And I hate to say it, because in a perfect world, I'd have local administrative rights too, but I don't. Especially around groups that are very operationally driven, but key to the business. Think of your executives as an example, also strategy related there too, but also your developers. If you've got development shops, if you slow them down through the unempathetic deployment of controls, then it will cost the business money. And that leads me into, if I say that the most strong thing you can do on the endpoint, because that's where attacks are typically going to begin. We all know the funny cat video story of phishing that moves to lateral movement, that moves to compromise. But if the assertion is that the first thing we should do is remove local administrative rights, then your response and what you're probably thinking is, yeah, Brandon, duh. It's way easier said than done, because the moment I start to remove local admin rights, those same users that you talked about earlier, including you, get grumpy and start looking for me. Rightfully so. Again, unempathetic removal of local administrative rights is a dangerous notion. Tends to only work after there's been a compelling event or a breach. Knock on wood, should none of that happen to any of you. But the angle that I'll take here from a comprehensive standpoint is, let's expect for this grass to be walked on. Let's expect for any controls that are done in an unempathetic way around local administrative rights to go very, very poorly, because they will. And then let's start to look at how we can do this in a more thoughtful way. Things like, and by the way, you can do this with all kinds of platforms out there. I mean, even operating system providers are providing providers are providing better stuff for this kind of thing. But my advice to you is, look at ways that you can remove local administrative rights and allow elevation based on the concept of trust. Things like allow listed software distributor, or simply elevating certain signed tools that are part of your infrastructure. It's a great way to start it. Policy-based elevation, I think, is the hotness for this kind of thing. But also, expect for there to not be a policy one day when one of your users really, really needs to elevate that thing. So also things like, hey, you don't have full administrative rights all the time, but I tell you what, if you submit the appropriate approval for an hour, we'll give you those rights. Not used all the time, but used as an edge example versus the norm as it relates to your policy. That's the notion of just-in-timey stuff that I have there at the bottom left. I'll also tell you, users are getting luckier as more of your organizations are stepping from beyond offering just one type of endpoint. Some of your users might want to consume their day-to-day operations from a Mac, or the really lucky users might get a Linux workstation. But we also need to be consistent around that least privilege, regardless of if our creative teams are running Macs and the rest of the organization is running Windows. So again, that's that coverage we mentioned in the silly metaphor earlier. But that's just one piece of the puzzle, right? Local administrative rights, I put that one on a pedestal because you can get a lot of fun stuff from a threat actor perspective. I realize that's sort of macabre there, but you can get a lot of distance from a threat actor's standpoint with using local administrative rights. But then there's all the stuff that can do bad things that don't require that local admin. I imagine many of you are tired of hearing about ransomware, so that's the only time I'm going to say it. But stuff like polymorphic malware that's doing things like encryption, the beauty of it, another macabre security guy thing, is that it runs in the user context, unless it gets really squirrely and gets more advanced and starts looking more like a human attacker, which a lot of recent those things, I'm not going to say it, are doing. For that kind of stuff, a lot of times we'll look to things like signature-based detection, which is fantastic, until we start looking at 0 days or things that are polymorphic. We also begin to look at things like application control, application allow listing or block listing as an example. Very effective, but in certain spots. For instance, an application allow list, which means that only the applications I've chosen can execute, works super well on a domain controller, not so well on a user's endpoint. Conversely, application block listing, where I block things after they occur or that I know I don't want to execute, requires us to know something happened. So it requires a thing to hit us, and then we say, ow, never again, I'm going to block it. So my advice here is there's a midpoint: restricted access, sandboxing, gray listing. There are a lot of different words for it that helps us create a safety net, allow unknown funky application to run, but don't let it run as an admin. Don't let it access the internet. Don't let it access the intranet or network shares or specific file extensions and that kind of thing. That's where application control, along with sandboxing and other endpoint controls, tends to help us get a tick beyond that very reactive policymaking security. Because when I'm talking about operational benefits, it's not just for your end users, it's for you too. Nobody, or some people, I'll let you be the judge, but it's not super fun to sit in a web console and to be constantly building policy around app control. It's painful, and some people might like to do it. My attention span won't let me do that kind of thing, but that helps us get out of there. And then finally, we're talking about the zombies. A lot of endpoint solutioning these days, again, I'm biased, is giving us a little bit more bang for our buck when it comes to looking for those malwares, or other words, that have learned to elevate access, to steal credentials, as an example, from the browser, remote connectivity tools, the cloud CLI clients, those are my favorite, to steal those credentials and use them. So when we're talking about endpoint security tooling, things like being able to detect and act on suspected credential theft or weird behavior, that also really ups the game here when we get a little bit more proactive, including being a little bit more devious and placing things like lures in the local administrative group or in the browser. It's not going to stop an attack when you've got a lure, but it directs you into indicators of compromise early on, giving your first responders time to, firstly, respond. So I could ramble on about this forever, but scaffolded security here in these three areas: least privilege, so key to the endpoint, app control, and then being more proactive with looking at credential theft as well as luring, can really upgrade our endpoint grass to those delivery folks and those zombies walking over it. Final thing I'll note here, there's a connection, by the way, between your vaulting and rotating EPAM and your endpoint security controls. And that is, if you've got a lot of folks who are remote, and chances are you do, their systems still have built-in administrative credentials. You might use the standard one. You might have created your own from an endpoint security and management perspective. If those systems don't come back and touch the corporate network very often, or don't touch a spot where your PAM solution can rotate them, they could go a year, 6 months, 3 months without consistent rotation. So as an example, one of the things that we've found really, really successful is, well, if we're going to put an agent somewhere, let's let that guy do things like help us remove users from the local admins group, or at the very least, change the built-in password in an easier way that doesn't require that persistent network access to your VPN or something like that. A lot of times, this isn't something you got to pay for. If you've got PAM, a lot of times PAM providers, or maybe I'm just speaking for CyberArk, but this is something that you'll normally have available to you. And it's a great way to extend a traditional PAM control out to your workforce and your other systems, which are at the forefront of, phishing, funny cat video links, and that kind of thing. So we talked about the trust of the endpoint. And I'll tell you, it sounds weird to say when it comes from a vendor. Hi, I'm a vendor. And that is, I submit to you all that there is a level of trust that's lower than silly workforce users like me who are accessing endpoints in their day-to-day. Because the thing about those workforce users, not silly, because I'll talk about your users, is that they've been educated by your teams. You have those programs in place. You give them kudos when they detect things like phishing and send that to your SOC. You've got strong security on your workstations. Users are personally vested because they're part of your org, with or without something like equity. They're part of your family. So these types of users, I will say, are more trusted than folks who sometimes you trust more to access those critical systems. Folks that connect from outside of your organization, folks who are third parties or part of vendors. In this example, that endpoint is untrusted. The security training is unknown. We don't know if CyberArk provides me the same level of security training that you provide your end users. I hope so. I would like to think so. And I'm confident the answer is yes, but it's an unknown, as well as accountability, as well as the workstation posture, right? We might not have the same types of tools and scaffolded controls on our endpoints. And yet somehow we're perfectly fine in a lot of cases with providing vendors VPN access and implicit network trust to connect with our network, as well as some of those critical systems in our network. So long story short, while vendors might be equal to your end user workforce, when we talk about the walking on the grass metaphor, I'd like to assume that they're not. Part of this, by the way, isn't technology or even PAM related. One of the things that we've seen it's been a big increase, not just in the pandemic, but right before, is this notion I made earlier, vendor recertification. Right in the beginning, when you start working with a vendor, sometimes you'd be okay with them giving you their SOC 2 and being done with it. But if your organization is looking at things like vendor certification, rehydration, amazing. It's an incredible way to go. We must continuously challenge our vendors to keep up their high levels of security that they originally told us that they had. For those of you using CyberArk, I challenge you to make sure that we're accountable for that kind of thing as well. But outside of recertification and the business side of things, when we start to look at that vendor level of trust, if you're using VPN for your vendors, if you're giving vendors an identity in your directory, make sure that number one, and I know sometimes it's hard because the network team has a gazillion things that they're doing, but if you're using VPNs, make sure your network teams are building out the appropriate network segmentation for those vendors. If you're provisioning them into your directory or into your identity provider, make sure you're recertifying and expiring their access, not putting a note in the calendar, hey, we'll recertify this after the project is over, and letting that access persist. Admittedly, at CyberArk, we saw this as one of the biggest questions from our customers who are deploying PAM, and heard it so much that we said, well, okay, we'll build something. So we actually have a mechanism that allows folks outside the org, whether it's vendors or even remote users from the coffee shop, the ability to strongly authenticate and then get provisioned with ephemeral access. So we nope their accounts out of existence based on policy, so you don't have to, and then get the benefit of everything that another privileged user might get in the org, access to PAM and that kind of thing. So there are a number of ways to climb this proverbial tree here. But the big thing here, if there's one thing you take away from the third party section, it's recertification of vendor trust has become a big key in comprehensive, modern, successful PAM programs these days. I could wax philosophical about it for a while. I do want to be respectful of time, though. I know if you got questions about that, throw them in the chat. As I said, it's something I can noodle on for a long time if you let me. I want to talk about the cloud, right? I want to go from outside the org to up in the beautiful rainbow superscape that is your organization's adoption of the cloud. It's beautiful, right? And again, maybe it's just me and my upside down brain, but when it comes to cloud adoption, outside of, and maybe a lot of you have seen this, that need to have workloads moved to the cloud yesterday. So there's always a sense of urgency in a lot of cases with cloud migrations. But outside of that, this idea of an environment that seeds automation, of an environment that connects with things like DevOps principles to seed collaboration, the always on anywhere availability, it's just an amazing thing to see adopt, as well as the native tools that cloud providers are giving us. But I'll tell you, with great power comes great responsibility. Sorry for the trope, but it's true, because the cool part about about our cloud vendors is that they give us tools to increase granularity of identity, to increase security in our cloud environments. Now, it's our responsibility as consumers of that cloud provider through shared responsibility models to implement it, but the tools are there and the granularity is there. So if we have systems somewhere or workflows somewhere, then of course there's going to be privileged access to configure them. So when we start to look at comprehensive PAM for the cloud, there are a couple of themes that I'll share with you around recommendations there. The first theme, as we turn this nifty little flywheel here, is the increased need for visibility. As I said way back in the beginning, you don't know what you don't know. When we start to look at our cloud environments, as I said, there are a number of granular permissions we can work with to create custom roles or even use built-in roles when we're talking about cloud identity. These days, I think if you tally up AWS, Azure, and GCP only, we're talking around 22,000 different permissions that you could use to establish least privilege. Chances are your organization might not be using that to its maximum effect. So one of the things we see, especially with these very rapid cloud migrations and adoptions, is the identity and security team might not know how that role makeup is constructed, which is why, based on that scale, discovery starts to be key. Whether we're looking at cloud identity or looking at API keys that are associated with virtual compute or cloud compute, as an example, we need to have some visibility. So discovery has actually become pretty key to this. But discovery is only visibility. So as we scoot this flywheel over just a little bit, the next thing we want to start doing is automating our response to that discovery. I'll give you, for instance, my ask to the team that runs our cloud labs, because I have a lab, believe it or not, was that I needed full administration in the cloud environment that we use. And the team said, okay, Brandon, that's fine, right? It was in the early days. Do I need full admin? Probably not. I can guarantee you that if we review my utilization, out of the something like 6,000 permissions that are part of that role, I've probably used 20 different permissions, which makes me a threat vector because I have a significant number of stale or underutilized permissions. Now, the good news is there are tools out there, CyberArk included, that can allow you to visualize all of the different human and non-human entities across your cloud environments to help you see that from a discovery perspective. But better yet, to say, hey, Brandon's only used 20 out of the 6,000 permissions he had. So here's a new policy for Brandon that you can apply using whatever infrastructure as code you happen to have, or policy as code that you're using, something like Terraform as an example. So here's this issue organized by risk. And then here are the sore thumbs that you want to engage in privilege and policy right sizing on in the early days. Here's how you do that, and here's how you apply it. Now, this is superimposed over things like session monitoring into cloud consoles as an example. Incredibly important. Cloud consoles have become, I realize this is going to date me a little bit, so I'm sorry, but cloud consoles have become the new hypervisor. Administrative access to a hypervisor, that's traditional PAM kind of stuff. We want to do stuff like vault and rotate that. Same is true with administrative access to your cloud, PaaS, and other SaaS consoles. It's there. It's just done differently. And again, we've got a different user type who's likely performing that administration, which is why some of that native access I mentioned before is just so critical here. So we'll scoot the flywheel over one final time. And that's when we start to look at that notion of things like vaulting and rotating cloud accounts and cloud keys. It's possible. Every provider will do it. Sometimes they might charge you extra, but it should be part of a PAM program. And a lot of times, if you've got PAM, especially if you've got CyberArk, you've already got capabilities like this one. But then there's that notion I mentioned earlier about ephemeral access, right? Say your organization says, hey, identity or security, we have got 3,000 new virtual machines we're spinning up every week. These virtual machines in the cloud are only going to be alive for a week. Manage them in PAM, manage access to them. your answer might be, okay, cool. Well, we can automate the onboarding of the built-in secrets for those, and then we can give access to the users. But the challenge there is you've got to bake in that automation. And you have to also bake in the dehydration of those virtual machines when they're noped out of existence in like a week. So instead, that's when just-in-time and ephemeral access starts to really come to the mix. Things like creating policies based on infrastructure tagging, not arbitrary connections between here's a username, here's a private IP, here's a username, here's a private IP. Instead, that model should be, well, I've got these infrastructure tags, policy applies to those so that tomorrow if 4,000 more spin up, as long as they've got those tags, policy still applies. That's one of the beauties, as I mentioned earlier, of the cloud. We've got these very native identification points that we can use for attribute-based policies. These are things that a comprehensive PAM program can also take advantage. It also helps us ask the question of to vault or not to vault. If it's short-lived, maybe we're more concerned about access than about traditional vaulting and rotation. So just one very, very important piece of modern or comprehensive PAM these days. And just for the sake of it, because I know how much you all love the animation, I'll give the flywheel one more cursory spin that doesn't actually add anything, but hey, it was cool. It was a cool effect, so I had to throw in one more. So I have one final concept I want to share with you as we close out our time together today, or whenever you happen to be watching it. So tomorrow, next month, whatever it might be. And that is, today I imagine many of you, as I was kind of chatting through some of these controls, I imagine many of your brains went to human access, rightfully so, right? All of us, maybe me excluded, are human, right? We can relate. But I'll tell you that consistent model that I mentioned earlier, when it came to the grass metaphor, that consistency includes any of the non-human identities that make up our monolithic applications, or even as we get into our services-based pipelines and other CI/CD tools. So for me, seeing things like this, a privileged secret or secret in general that's made it to a public code repository, makes me as sad as David Tennant here in the rain. And by the way, if you've not done this exercise before and you're feeling frisky over the weekend, head over to GitHub, search by recent code commit, and put in your favorite secret name there. I guarantee you, within sometimes as soon as 2 minutes, you'll find an access key, secret key pair, an application key, a database credential, chilling out in a public code repository. Accidents do happen as part of those pipelines. If you ever want to have more fun, go to Shodan and look for your favorite CI/CD tool and see how many folks have it exposed over port 80 or 8080 to the public internet. It will blow your minds, or you won't be surprised at all and you'll be like, yeah, totally knew that was a thing. But non-humans are just as important in our PAM programs as humans. And one of the best things that we can do here is apply the same good common sense identity practices to our applications. But you might be thinking, well, okay, you mean like multi-factor, right? Yeah, like multi-factor. But it's kind of hard for an application to do multi-factor, right? Because applications don't have tokens floating around, right? They don't have a nifty QR code authenticator. They can't give me an ID badge. They're these unfeeling processes that are executing. One of the reasons why we'll typically focus on humans in programs and leave those applications. But one of the things you can do here is authenticate applications not using another secret. Because think about it. If you're hooking applications to PAM and you take a secret out of your application, your vulnerability scanner, your RPA tool, your configuration management platform, whatever it is, if you pluck a secret out of that, put it into a vault, and then give that application a secret to authenticate to the vault to pull the original secret that you took from the code, well, you've done something really neat, but added very little security value. You've replaced one secret with another secret. So the jam here is use attributes, things like an application signature of the whole app or of individual pieces of the calling stack. Trusted run as users, as an example. These are very applicable to more monolithic applications, J2EE kind of stuff, anything on-prem. And then as you start to look at the cloud, as I said earlier, there's some pretty nifty native things we can do to establish trust. Things like IAM roles, managed identities, cloud identities, and functions. These are ways we can authenticate non-humans using native elements of cloud trust. It's pretty nifty. As we get into Kubernetes and OpenShift, again, we have a litany of native things that are available to us, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. But the final thing I'll say here is I'll tell you a story if you're all okay with it. When we look at the dichotomy between human access and application access from a prioritization standpoint, as I said, a lot of times we'll start with humans. The way I can describe that is by telling you that I have a Roomba at home. I love my Roomba. I say at home like I'm at my house right now. I have a Roomba here somewhere out of that door there. My Roomba's name is Fraser. I'm pretty proud of its name. Roomba's a robot, right? It goes around and vacuums in all areas of my house when I'm not here. I have applied a significant amount of trust to this machine. This is very true of how we'll typically trust applications, give them the most privileges needed because we're afraid they're going to break, and not think anything of it because they're not humans. So I've got this robot running around vacuuming at all hours of the day with full access to my house. But what would you say if I showed up at your house with a Hoover and I was like, hey, if you give me the key to your house, what I'll do is I'll show up every Thursday at around this time and I'll vacuum everything for you. Your response is probably going to be, get that crazy person out of my patio. I never want to talk to him again. It's very similar to the way the dichotomy that we see, especially when we look at recent breaches of we've got human identity sorted out, but we haven't yet gotten to applications because they're different, or we're afraid that they'll break, or they're just so operationally important that we don't even want to extend our program there. So silly example, but it does paint that picture, I think, very, very well of being consistent between our humans and our non-humans too. But the last thing I want to talk about as it relates to applications is I want to talk about your developers for a second. If you don't have developers, any of your users who are writing scripts or other elements of non-compiled or pseudocode, this includes any of your citizen developers who might be working on RPA. If we ask them, based on what I told you before, if we ask them for the sake of security to change their code, well, you'll probably get something like this, where folks tend to go around or they build their own processes because it's just too much of a lift. So when you approach that application PAM or application secrets management angle, one of the most important things here is follow the integrations, right? Make sure that the vaults you're using are integrated with your RPA platforms, your vulnerability scanners, your CI/CD tools, so that code doesn't need to change. And then even look in the open source for things that help with migration. On the right there are two things that we do in an open source capacity for secret injection to variables, so developers don't have to change code that's using variabilization. We call it summon. Or even reducing or removing secrets from an application's knowledge altogether. We call this secretless. Again, these are both open source elements that can work with any vault that you're using, but we're just so keen on developer experience that that we had to make them available, and also had to hook them to the application secret management that we do. So consistency in applications as well, as we kind of get to the top of our conversation together. By the way, quick digression. When your applications are running in the cloud, the two concepts I share with you combine. Think of applications that might be pulling secrets from a vault as an example, going out and running operations in your cloud. Well, those applications have identities too that you can then look for permissions right sizing. It's one of the nifty parts about doing permissions discovery, is that it doesn't differentiate human versus non-human because everything gets a role. So permissions-based lifecycle management or right sizing is a big possibility using modern tool sets today. Again, you see CyberArk specific tooling here, but this is not a concept that is that is native or that is cornered by CyberArk. It's just something that we put a lot of time and attention into. So we can even right size permissioning for our applications in the cloud, in addition to making sure the secrets they're using are secured appropriately. Really, we looked at a number of different themes today, but the main goal here was to sit in the center of processes, sit between a user and the network, sit between our applications and the secrets that might be stored there in plain text there in code, which we never want to do, but to do what we can to limit the amount of lateral movement or to report and notify you of lateral movement occurring. I think this is a more marketing friendly way to say, don't, plan for your grass to be walked upon. But as you noticed, it's a very key driver in a lot of the work we're doing at CyberArk. As a quick way to summarize before we make some time for any questions that you all asked, and if you do have a question or a comment or a grievance, throw it in the chat now if you're comfortable with it and wouldn't mind. Happy to talk to those. And I've probably earned at least 3 grievances from you all out there. But when we look at comprehensive PAM, there are going to be some self-evident truths. That is, as our environments become more modern, as scope expands, we must look at automation, learn from what our cloud architecture and infrastructure teams are doing, and automate things like response, things like onboarding and discovery, like we chatted on earlier. We want to be consistent in those dichotomies from human to non-human, from standing access to just-in-time, from on-prem to cloud, from mainframe to microservices, while I'm putting out catchphrases that, I don't know, maybe we put them on some t-shirts or something like that. And it's also important to not just rely on solutions in a vacuum. I didn't talk about this a lot outside of the application stuff, but keep challenger vendors to integrate with one another. It's one of the things that I think has made CyberArk as an organization successful, in that we recognize that PAM in a vacuum that doesn't integrate with your vulnerability scanners or your phishing detection solutions or your privileged task automation tools, without those integrations and partnerships, it's just PAM in a vacuum, kind of floating around on its own. So challenge your vendors to integrate and hook things together. It's a quick win most of the time. And then finally, as you're looking at PAM, don't forget your endpoints, your workforce. Don't forget your vendors, as well as your applications. And if your organizations are moving to the cloud, have moved, or are planning it, if your PAM or identity teams aren't meeting with the cloud team regularly, it's one of the best things you can do, just to communicate, hey, here are the policies that we've got going on. Here's what we're building, even from a learning perspective too. It can be pretty enlightening, at least that in our experience. But these are the things that we believe go into that consistent and comprehensive PAM program, outside of the still very critical core of PAM: vaulting, rotation, isolation, monitoring, and response. Naturally, this is advice from one guy. This is actually part of something that we've built over the years based on incident response, called a blueprint, this idea of comprehensive privileged access. I'm showing you this because I also want you to know that you're not alone. Whether it's talking to your fellow peers, as well as fellow members of IDSA, or whether it's reaching out to vendors directly or partners, there are time-tested methods for deploying these things, for helping you prioritize. So one of the worst things you can do is go at it by your lonesome. Reach out to any of your close lifelines, or if you don't have a close lifeline, feel free to reach out to me, and we can definitely help you find assistance, whether it's in PAM, it's PAM adjacent, or beyond. I think one of the important things to me here is that we're all a team in securing identities and the world as we know it. So we should be working together versus kind of working in our own little subspaces and keeping knowledge to ourselves. That being said, thank you all so much for putting up with me for almost an hour here as we kind of chatted about the evolution of PAM a little bit. There's a QR code here. If you wanted to see more about any of this stuff, feel free to scan it. I promise you it's legit. It's your choice whether or not you want to trust me. Or always feel free to reach out to me. You can find me at brandont@cyberark.com. Anything that you need, anything that it makes sense for me to expand on, or just any feedback you have is greatly welcome and greatly appreciated. So Greg, I'll pass it over to you. Do we have any questions that came from the chat that we've got time in the next couple minutes to answer?
BT, I don't see any questions or grievances. Lots of applause and enjoyment in the presentation. And I can also confirm that that QR code is legit. So if you do have any questions, definitely encourage you to reach out, or obviously reach out to BT. His email is here. But great work as always, and appreciate the presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Greg. Everyone, thanks again. Julie, thank you and the IDSA so much for making this webinar possible. Really appreciate the time and the advocacy from you and from all of you. So thanks again, everyone. Have a good one.